Good morning. Good morning and welcome to our latest Brunch and Learn. I hope everyone is well on this Thursday morning, the Thursday in the lead up to Christmas now, which is a bit mad. My neighbour had put their Christmas lights up yesterday, which I thought was relatively shocking. But I guess fireworks night's done, so people are moving on to Christmas. But there you go. So I'm Becky. I'm founder and CEO here at Reflect Digital, and thank you so much for joining us. We're a performance marketing agency, and we're here to unleash your potential. And we do that by combining behavioral insights with digital marketing to help you really truly understand what it is that your audience cares about and make sure that we can meet them in the right places at the right time with the right message. So hopefully if you ordered a brunch box, you'll have received it. So thank you so much to Erin and Lucy for getting those out, and feel free to tuck in. If you've already eaten it, that's fine. Or if you're saving it, that's also fine. We want today to be interactive, so we will have time, and we'll have quite a bit of time today actually for questions. So as we're going through, if you've got any questions, pop them into the comments and we can pick those up afterwards. We're using muted standard view today is going to be the best setup for your Zoom, so that makes sure that you can see the slides and that you can see Lottie when she's talking. So we are talking about using your competitors to supercharge your search. Now, this is fresh off of the Brighton SEO main stage. So Lottie delivered this back at the beginning of October to a room of about 2,000 people, and it went down really well, which is why we thought we'd bring it to our Brunch and Learn. Now, the only thing I will say is Lottie's struggling with her voice a little bit today. She's woken up with one of the lovely bugs that seem to be going around, and her throat is feeling a bit sorry. So she's going to do her best, but if she needs to keep having a drink, please bear with her. So what is this about? We're talking about how you can, by following what your competitors are doing and understanding how they're approaching their campaigns, you can use that knowledge to supercharge your own campaign. And I won't tell you much more, because that's the beauty of what Lottie's going to go through. But if you haven't met Lottie before, she is our Director of Behavioural Science and Innovation here at Reflect Digital. You might have previously known her as our Head of Paid. She's recently had a very fancy job title change and role change, which is fabulous. She's got over 11 years experience working with paid media, but also really focusing on audience strategies. That's her real passion, is understanding audiences, understanding messaging and what channels we can use and how we can meet those audiences online. So she's got a huge amount of experience across lots of different sectors, from retail to e-com to B2B, pharma, finance, publishing, gambling, traveling. It just goes on. She also has a PhD, so she is a doctor. Which I always enjoy talking about, because her PhD was in Earth and planetary science and focusing on the habitability of Mars. So maybe that's one to pick up with her next time you catch up with Lottie. So let me hand over to Lottie. She is going to wow us with her fabulous talk, and then we'll be answering your questions. So over to you, Lottie.
Thank you so much, Becky. What a lovely introduction. Thank you. Yes, so do bear with me. Apologies if I have to cough a little bit or have a few drinks through the talk today. I'm feeling fine. It's just that my voice is very deep and croaky, so apologies for that. But I'm really excited to be here today to talk to you about using your competitors to supercharge your search. Becky mentioned this is a talk that I've done at Brighton SEO, but it's one of my favourite topics, and I think it's a very underappreciated resource that we have as marketers to ensure that we're really capitalizing on the performance we can gain with our campaigns. So I want to start us off by taking a moment to sit and think about those moments where you have launched a new campaign, you have produced some piece of content, or you've done a new strategy, and the performance that you've seen just hasn't been what you had expected. You've had a look in all of the background, the setup's correct, everything makes sort of sense in terms of what you're expecting, but you've just not had that performance. Had that light bulb moment, which I've had many times, where you realise that, you know what, this may not actually be anything to do with what we have done as a team or as a business. And I think that this quote here from Clint Eastwood during more of his political days is a really nice one to demonstrate not only that point, but also what I'm going to talk about today. It's not about you, it's about them. Them being your competitors and also your customers, because obviously that has a massive impact in terms of what you're doing. So again, take a moment to think about how many brands this year you have either been newly exposed to or you've tried as a new brand. So these are some examples of the brands that I've maybe either been newly exposed to or ones that I've actually engaged with recently in the last sort of six to 12 months or so. Some two nice examples to demonstrate the importance of understanding what is important to your customers is I've been a an avid user of eBay for many, many years for my pre-loved fashion source. But more recently, and I'd say in about the last 6 months or so, Vinted, which was a brand I was sort of aware of but hadn't really engaged with, became something that I've actually really enjoyed shopping with. It's given me an alternative option to purchase pre-loved items, which is different to what eBay offers, but it has meant I have used eBay a lot less than I had done previously. Blinkist is another really good example. I love Audible. I'm sure I'm not alone in that. But in the last sort of 6 months, again, 7, 8 months or so, Blinkist was a brand that one of my friends introduced me to, and actually really opened my opportunities for audio listening. So I like to I drive a lot in the car, so it's nice to have either audiobooks, but actually now I can start to listen to other types of content whilst I do that drive. So whilst I am still using Audible to a large extent, Blinkist now is one of those other brands that when I'm sitting there thinking, what do I want to listen to, I'm not necessarily defaulting to Audible. And you'll know, I'm sure, when what I've just talked through, that I'm not alone, but neither are you, in that sense of that many brands that you've recently engaged with or started to consider in your consideration set. There's also an alien in there because I thought I needed to put that in there as a nod. So 71% of people have switched brands at least once in the last year. So, you know, that's a huge proportion of people. 70% of people will switch brands for a higher perceived quality alternative. So again, you know, it doesn't really matter necessarily whether your product has changed, but if there's a perception that someone else's product might be a better quality, then there's a risk there. 66% of people will switch because of better deals. And obviously, the current economic situation, this applies not only from a B2C perspective, like people from their personal circumstances, but also, as we know, in a business circumstance as well. People are constantly looking for better deals as their budgets are constantly being squeezed. And as part of that, people are looking to constantly sort of make their decisions based on their new personal circumstances as that switches as well. So whilst it's a smaller proportion, it still shows that indication that there's that necessity for people to maybe make decisions not based on what they want from maybe an emotional perspective, but what they need to do instead. And if you also think about the fact that you can have up to typically 5 brands in your consideration set, that's a lot of brands. So your competition is really high. And humans are both fickle and they're biased at the same time, which makes decision making influenced by a variety of different factors whenever someone's making that choice. And a lot of people here will be familiar with Google's messy middle, and it's a really nice way to visualize that challenging position that we're in from marketers' perspective to try and influence that decision making through that exploration and evaluation phases. And at Reflect, we use the COM-B model for behavioural change, which stands for COM-B standing for capability, opportunity, motivation, which then ultimately, by having all of those 3 factors, you will be able to see that behaviour happen. If there are any kind of barriers to any of those 3, so barriers for capability, opportunity, or motivation, that could be a reason why you're not necessarily seeing the desired behaviour that you want. And that's a really important thing to consider when we're looking at how we're trying to achieve the desired outcome with our marketing activity. And as I mentioned, there are so many different factors that will influence decision. And quite often we will focus on the more practical, rational decision-making processes without necessarily considering how much emotion can really come into this. And that's not just from a consumer perspective. So we might automatically think that if someone's buying something on a retail perspective, like there could be an emotional attachment. But even in a business context, there will be an emotional attachment to those decision-making processes that really matters to them as an individual, as well as from a more of a business context as well. But I've just got some examples here of the typical kinds of factors which can influence that decision-making. As I said, that emotional side, experience, and again, that could be anything from your own experience to someone who knows experience, and that could be good or bad, which ultimately could influence the decision that you're making. Social influence, which we're all very familiar with, and how much that can impact people's decision making, but also things like decision fatigue and default decision, where people will make decisions based on what's the most easiest route for them. I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of these elements later on. So what factors are currently influencing your consumers' decisions? And if you don't know the answer to that question, that's really one of the key ones. So going back to that original point about, can your search performance be judged on your tactics alone? And hopefully you agree with me, the answer is no. So that hopefully will give you your own light bulb moment when you're in that position and being asked, what's gone wrong here? Why hasn't this worked? What have you done? It's not necessarily about what you had done. It's understanding what's going on in the marketplace around you. And from the second half of what we're going to talk about today should give you the tools and the approach that you need in order to be able to come to that question with the right answers. So to start with, you need to keep your finger on the pulse of your customers' needs. and the competition's strategy and their tactics. Because if you think about the fact that they're potentially constantly changing what they're up to, same way that we're potentially doing the same thing, we need to be aware of what that is. So, excuse me, so let's look at examples. So as I mentioned, so many brands ultimately will do the same thing. So I know as when we love our brand, we're like, we've got our USPs, but quite often, majority of the brands are fundamentally at the core really offer the same thing with some nuances within there. So I've got quite experience with working with experiential gifting brands. So we're just going to have a little look at some of these examples. And these are really nice ones because the breadth of the types of products that they offer is so huge. So we're going to have a quick look at red letter days, version experience days, and buy a gift. And actually, if you look at the homepage of these three brands, whilst actually in this example, the percentage discount is slightly different, which is in itself important. If you look at the navigation of the website and the basic offers that they are providing, they all provide the same thing. They all offer things like driving experiences, dining experiences, short break, flying experiences, whatever it might be. Ultimately, they all offer the same thing. If we then take a step back to the sort of shop window, if you like, when someone's searching on Google or Microsoft and looking for an answer to the solution to their challenge, we can then start to see what they're being confronted with at the very beginning. So at the top here, we've got the example of red letter days. And within this is an ad, text-based ad that we're showing here. But as we'll talk about in a moment, this is still super relevant for SEO as well. Within the ad here, from their headline and the description lines, they focus on credibility with using official in the headline, but also availability and validity. So the vouchers are available for 12 months and you get the next day delivery. Moving down to buy a gift, they focus a bit more on that validity. So that's very much been prominent in that headline with the vouchers being valid for 12 months. But they go down a really much more emotional route of give a loved one a unique and special present for all occasions. How sweet is that? And then if you move down to version experience days, they again move more into the range and discounts. So they've got thousands of unique and wonderful experiences, and they have sort of mentioned that discount on the ad itself as well. So when you look at those ads at their very core and sort of analyze it very sort of structurally, they speak to very different needs. But then the question is, which one of those is most important? Thinking about what impact that message has on the consumers, and all of a sudden we had three different offerings where, for example, when we looked at the more emotive language, if that's somebody who's actually looking to try and gift for their loved one, that is something that would probably speak more to their focus area versus maybe someone who is more price dependent and price focused. So ultimately, these brands have used nudges to encourage behaviour, and just to make sure that we're all on the same page, a nudge is a small tweak to an environment that can have a positive and big impact on behaviour without limiting choice. And as I mentioned earlier on, we're going to talk a little bit about some of these nudges and consider the mental shortcuts or biases which influence the decisions that we make. So these are really nice examples which relate to the experiential gifting space. So we've got here choice overload. So when you're giving too many choices to people, that people find it difficult. We all know, we can think of that ourselves if we sit down and consider that. If we're overwhelmed with the amount of choice and variety that we have, sometimes that can stop and prevent us from making a decision. And if we look at one of the ads that we showed earlier, we're talking about thousands of products available. Well, do I want to sift through thousands of products? The answer is no. So it's about kind of condensing that into a manageable number, which still provides range, but doesn't feel overwhelming. Scarcity effect. So this is one actually that we're very sort of well versed at using within the marketing space, where people assign high value to items that they perceive as being limited. So that's why we use things like countdown timers or limited offers, for example, because it gives that feeling of urgency to not miss out. And then present bias, where people prioritize short-term rewards over some of those long-term gains. I think this is, again, very interesting in the example of the experiential gifting, where we're looking at the focus on the 12-month validity. Now, how actually important is that 12-month validity for a voucher versus the discount that someone will immediately get if they purchase a product with that particular brand over an alternative? Now, during COVID, this was obviously a really big thing. People wanted that extended voucher validity. The question is that still something that's super important to customers when they are purchasing these sorts of products? So that's a bit about the theory, and now I'm going to go into a little bit more about the practical elements of how you can actually go about putting some of this together and help support your own marketing strategy. So to start with, like any good scientist, you observe. So you look at your competition and your customers. So you firstly look at what did they do in the past. And again, we can be quite forgetful of actually looking historically at what's been going on. So what kind of offers were they showing previously? What kind of messaging have they used? What kind of products are they focusing on as a business? Then look at what are they doing now. Obviously, this is the here and now, and that's super relevant for our customers. But understanding then how does that differ from what they were doing to where they are today? And then what do we think that they might do in the future? The more challenging part of it is that hypothesis of, okay, well, what do we think they might be up to in the next year? What do we think that their marketing strategy might be for the next year? Because obviously that's really important information we will need to know to help us understand what we need to be doing for our own. There are so many different sources of information that you can use to acquire this data. So from a competition perspective, things like auction insights from your Google Ads accounts. You can look at doing competitor audits. We're going to talk a little bit more about how to go about that process in more detail in a moment. Ad reviews, which kind of comes into that audit element as well. USP monitoring, rankings monitoring, keyword coverage, brand search strategy. What are they doing there? They're all super easy ways to try and start to get some of that additional information. And from a customer's perspective, understanding those search trends, using search trends to look at that. Social listening. So, this can be, as I'll talk about in a moment, through third-party tools, or even, just taking the time to kind of look at what's going on with your competitors. Customer surveys, so getting that first-hand information from your customers on a regular basis. Website engagement audits, messaging, testing, customer journey maps. And actually, I think that's another really important area that we often overlook when we are trying to understand what best to be doing. And as I mentioned, one of the kind of baseline elements of taking this approach is understanding where you're going to get that data from. And there are a variety of different sources of information, some of which are here. There are more of these as well. But as I said earlier, this doesn't have to be an expensive task. So some of these are paid for tools. Otherwise, you are able to do some of this manually yourself, or use kind of relatively cheap tools in order to acquire that information. And another point that I think is super important that I think brands quite often forget is identifying who your search competition is. Now, that can differ from who your business competitors set are. So I can't count the number of times we've been in sort of a situation where it's like, oh, well, these are our competitors that we focus on as a business. This is what we're looking at from a board level. This is who we're interested in. But when we look at our search, our auction insights, for example, we actually look at who's appearing next to us in the search results page. They could be completely different, or there could be other brands in there that just hadn't been considered. In this case, well, they're not our competition. Well, they are your competition because they are appearing against you in that search results page. Your consumers are being confronted with both those brands at the same time. That brand has decided, intentionally or otherwise, to appear for that search term at that time. So your role is still to compete to an extent with that competitor. So understanding what they're doing is still really important. A really good example of this is Amazon. And I think a lot of brands will be like, oh, it's Amazon, like they're a bear moss. We're never going to, what's the point in worrying about what they're up to? You're not necessarily going to be able to do anything about it, but it's still super important to understand what are Amazon up to? What approach are they taking? When are they appearing against us? Because that ultimately will potentially have quite a big impact in terms of the performance that you're seeing. So I think that's really vital to remember. Don't disregard brands because either they're too big or they're not considered as a standard competitor. It's about who actually are your consumers being confronted with at that point of consideration. So once you've decided on the data sources you're using, then the frequency of data acquisition is also super important. And that will depend on the types of tools you're using, but also the size of your team, how much time you've got available to you. But I would still say, regardless of whether you go on a more granular level or on a larger scale, you're still going to get so many valuable insights just by starting to implement some of these ideas. So a really simple version of doing this, obviously, you can use some of these fancy tools, is literally just taking some screenshots of the search results page. You just note down like when this was obviously taken, time of day and day of week, date of the actual screenshot. And then you're starting to copy down like what did the different ads or listings show to that person when someone searched, when you searched on that page, what did it say? And what did your content say relative to the competitors? And by building out even in a deck format, so you can have this like a different page per day, or however frequently you're doing it, we're then going to start to build up that picture. And as long as you're kind of analysing that data, you're then going to be able to start to understand a little bit more about how that's changing potentially through time. And then another key area to consider is reviewing your customer needs on at least a quarterly basis. Again, a lot of brands will look at things on an annual basis. It's like we'll do a review on an annual level. The challenge with that is that we know people change so much so quickly. The situation changes so rapidly that if you're not necessarily keeping your finger on what's going on a more shorter term basis, you're going to miss some of those sort of nuances and how things have changed over that year. So reviewing it at least on a quarterly basis, doing search and social listening will help you understand what has changed in the last 3 months that actually could really impact your own strategy. And ultimately, with all of this, you're building a bank of insights and knowledge. So the idea isn't that, you're going to be able to go away tomorrow and be like, bang, I'm going to get all this insight straight away. The idea is that you're starting to build up that repository of information that you can then utilize at a later stage to inform what you're doing. So a really nice example, we're kind of very, very topical, as mentioned about kind of coming up to Christmas. So you've got the lovely period of Black Friday. So obviously for any retail e-commerce or any brands for whom that's irrelevant, equally for travel coming into January or any other sector when you've got your peak periods, financial year end. By starting to build up that bank of information now, let's say for Black Friday, you could start either on a daily or at least weekly basis. I'd say as you're getting closer to Black Friday, doing it on a daily basis is recommended, because you'll see that brands are going to start to change their offerings, their strategy potentially as they're going into that period. But starting to look at not only the ad copy, but what channels they're appearing on. So it might be that they've integrated YouTube into their strategy for this peak period, which they don't typically do. It's really useful to then have all of that information, which you can then utilize. So whilst you might not be able to action anything this time round, although you might be able to make some changes, because I have worked with brands where it's a case of like, we've gone through this process, we've identified that discounts have differed maybe with one brand compared to what we're offering. We've had to make a decision as to whether we're going to try and compete with that or if we're going to go down a different route. But ultimately, you're going to store that information either for next year, but equally, you can still use this information and insight for other peak periods as they come through. But it's a really good exciting opportunity to start this process right away. So then once you've done that, you can then start to plan. So consider all of the factors that influence the decision. So really sitting down and going through that process of understanding. So when we offer a promotion, obviously from our perspective, it's like, oh, that's great as a standalone piece. But there are so many different factors that will come into play. And when you're a consumer, particularly if you're deal focused or really aware of price, some of these other elements here could be more important. So they're actually going to have a bit more insight into what the sort of small print essentially is around that promotion. And then when you're structuring your calendar, your content calendars, with your own KPIs in mind, so you're looking here at creating like what content are we creating relative to each of the months. Is a very simple, simplified version. But alongside that, again, if we're looking from a retail perspective, you've got your promotions that you're then going to say, like we're going to do, say, like 25% site-wide discount. You might have Mother's Day discount codes, 2-for-1 weekend trips, whatever it might be. That's all great. And then the enhancing of that is an overlaying from what your competitor research has shown you. So then all of a sudden you've got not only your content calendar, but you've also got your competitors' content calendars overlaid. So from that approach of understanding, okay, what did they do last year? Now we can start to fill in the gaps of what we think they might be going to be doing this year. What discounts did they run previously? What do we think they might be going with this year? And then obviously we can compare that to what we're actually going to be approaching ourselves. We'll start to identify differences potentially in the offering. And again, if we think about the fact that if you're then going to be from a consumer perspective confronted with these two offers, what kind of impact do we think that that's going to have on the response rates to our ads or our content or creative? And then you test. But remember that the variables you're testing are not just your own. So again, when you're in that situation of testing, it's like, oh, well, we've got these tests, but it hasn't performed the way we thought it would. But actually, you're only looking at 2 elements of that variable. There are so many other factors that are out of your control that are happening at the same time. And your tests are at least two-sided, because it looks nice on this side. But they're at least two-sided. So you're testing your copy against itself, but you're also testing it against what your competitors are up to as well. And then finally, you will evaluate. So we've got an example here of using click-through rates, where we have plotted over our own brand promotion, where we can see that uplifting click-through rate off the back of that. What you can then do, obviously, with that competitor insight research that you've done is then overlay your competitor brand's promotion. What kind of impact did that then have on the click-through rate we were seeing with our campaigns? And then you can explore the impact your message has had on the engagement you're seeing, and then ultimately decide how your strategy needs to adapt to what's going on around you, allowing you to be both strategic and responsive, which is so important, particularly as we're finding people are things not static and are constantly changing. And this strategy ensures that your brand can remain responsive to the market changes of your competition, but also of your customers' needs, which will also be adapting. So to quickly recap, sorry. A little bit more back on. The four main stages that we work through is about observing. So first of all, observe your customers and your competition. Keep an eye on what they're up to, because chances are they're probably doing the same to you. Plan based on the research. Think about what you're going to be doing and use that information to really solidify and make those decisions around your strategy. Testing. So consider all of the variables that are coming into play. When you're kind of evaluating something, obviously don't just be too focused on exactly what's going on from the perspective of what you've been doing, but also think about what else is happening around you. And then finally, evaluate with your competition in mind. So when you're looking at what the results are showing you, just think about, okay, what tactics and strategies have we personally taken? What have we done in our accounts that we've changed this year versus previously? But include those insights you've got from your competition as well. And as I mentioned, you can start as big or as small as you like. So this isn't, it doesn't mean that you've got to have huge budgets to be able to do this. It can be really simple. So things like the Google Transparency Center, doing a simple SERP review, but there are other channels as well that you can use that you can pay for, which can give additional insights. Looking at the cadence of when you're going to be doing this, so monthly or weekly, generally speaking, is more than sufficient. But if you're coming into a peak period, you might want to consider daily. And then what's really important is it's all and good having all this data and information, but it's the action off the back of it that's so important. So you're creating that repository of changes that you're tracking, you're reviewing it on a weekly basis, and then you're deciding what the actions are off the back of that to make sure that what you're making the most of that information and data that you've got available to you. And the biggest risk associated, in my opinion, with ignoring that environment, there are quite a few really. So reduced credibility. So as we know, if we're not able to understand how to speak to our customers because we're not listening to what they're saying, then that ultimately will mean that we are less credible in the marketplace versus our competitors. Sorry, we're losing market share. Ultimately, if your competitors are able to adapt more easily to the environment because they have made more of that effort to look at their customers and what's going on around them, then ultimately you're going to be losing out on that opportunity as they're growing their market share. They're taking that from somewhere. You'll become less relevant because you're not staying in touch and listening to what's going on. And again, that's so important for customers to feel that you are listening to them, the authentic, but you're also up to date and relevant. It will stunt your growth ultimately, because if you are losing that market share, you're not gaining that market share. And ultimately, your competitors are capitalizing on that opportunity. And that lack of innovation, which I think is super important. We're all, again, very capable of looking at what's going on along in our own four walls. What can be the real ultimate game changer is when you're looking outside of that, what's going on, and that can really help drive that innovation. Another interesting point, actually, I forgot to mention earlier on, is around not only with your competitors being that kind of direct competitor set of those brands that are ones that are in your sector, but also looking outside of that, who else within a similar product type or similar type of journey, customer journey that might be going through. What can you learn from those experiences as well that you can also use? But ultimately, like keeping your eye around what's going on, not just on what you're doing yourselves, will help with that innovation as well. So hopefully I've given you lots of food for thought and lots of opportunity to kind of go away and either start something even today, or if not today, then maybe tomorrow. And ultimately, I want you to go away with remembering that quote from the beginning, that it's not about you, it's about them. And that's, with that in mind, you can only go from strength to strength with your marketing strategy. So thank you so much for listening. There are you can download the slides, I think, although you get the slides, I think, sent to you anyway. But we also have got a performing and tracking a training program, which I found very difficult to say, which is coming up in the new year, which is super exciting. So myself and a couple of the other guys in the team will be going through this training program covering a variety of different topics, I think, on here. So GTM tracking, advanced GA4, behavioral science and data, if you want to find out more about how to unearth some of these insights, things like, using it for customer journey mapping, etc. Also things like data storytelling, so really helping people to better tell the narrative of what they're trying to say internally to their stakeholders as well as their customers. So yeah, the spaces are limited, so please do check it out and sign up soon so you don't miss out. Thanks so much for listening. I think we've got some questions now that we were going to go to.
We have got some questions, and well done your voice. You can rest for a second. But yeah, that was brilliant. Thank you so much, Lottie. And that's probably the, I don't know, 5th or 6th time I've seen that, and I'm still learning and I love it. So that was brilliant. Thank you. So now's the time, if you have got any questions, to pop them in. We've got some of the questions that were pre-asked, so thank you for those. We're going to go through those now, but I will keep an eye for any live questions. So first up, Oh, we've got the lovely Alan from Channel Assist. Hi, Alan, if you're with us today. So he's asked what tools or systems are most effective at tracking our competition and how do we create meaningful action from this insight? So you've answered some of that in what you've talked about, I guess, but is that as a kind of focus?
Yeah, I think so. With this, it's the size of budgets obviously is a real factor, and I think that's something that I'm really conscious of this whole talk. People can, or brands can, invest a lot of money on some of these tracking tools, which is great. But depending on the size of your business, and we're also getting that buy-in as well initially. So if you don't have that budget straight away, even doing some of this stuff on a more manual basis can really give you the insights initially to help you understand exactly how to sell that idea in to get those automated solutions. But so we talked about the sort of off-the-shelf sort of solutions. So things like Brand Verity, for example, Adthena, SpyFu as well, other platforms like paid for platforms. That there are so many different platforms, and to be honest with you, a lot of them kind of do the same sorts of things. So I wouldn't necessarily say that we'd recommend any over any others, but there are also ways of acquiring that data kind of yourselves. As I said, in terms of like looking at the web pages, the search results page itself, or there are tools that that you can access as well. So if you're interested in something that we could potentially support you with in terms of getting some of that data, then please do reach out, because we're working on something at the moment, a very exciting project currently internally. So we'd love to talk a bit more about that. But yeah, I think ultimately, whichever tool, it's just I would start, if you haven't got a tool already. My suggestion would be to obviously start with some of that manual process of demonstrating the value that it can bring to you as a business, and then use that to then justify the investment into the scale. Because obviously, if you're a smaller business and you've got a smaller competitor set, smaller, let's say keyword ranges or whatever, product ranges, then potentially you could just do that on a manual basis. If you're talking on a larger scale, then obviously some of these larger solutions are going to be more appropriate.
Definitely. And I guess when you're, because to the last point of the question around kind of meaningful action from it, when you're analysing the data that you're seeing, I suppose the bit that you do not know, or there's a couple of bits you don't know. One, you actually don't know how well it's performing for that competitor. You have no idea. You might go, oh, they've got more money off than us, but is it actually working? We don't know that. But also, we don't know what audience profiling they've done of who they're really trying to target. So it's kind of also trying to layer in staying true to yourself, I suppose, in that sense of, no, but we're going for these people and this is why. But I suppose it's still being able to justify that and then knowing, well, but this is what we're up against. Which if we don't know that, then we kind of just don't know why ours is working or not working.
No, exactly. So it's not a case of like, let's just copy what someone else is up to, because exactly for those reasons. So there is, good examples where brands will suddenly go into sale. It's because they're struggling. That's why they've gone into sale. It's not because it's a strategic decision they've planned to do months ago. It's because it's a knee-jerk reaction because of the situation that they're personally in. So it doesn't mean you have to knee-jerk response as well, but it's more about understanding, because ultimately if they do go into a sale, the customer doesn't care as to why they've done that. But what it might mean is it impacts your numbers, and that's what you need to be aware of. And that's where that insight comes in, rather than it being a case of like, oh, they've gone into 7, well, now we'll do that. And now they've gone, oh, we're going to follow. Like Black Friday is a really good example where some brand, like a lot of brands now are deciding just not to bother going into any sale promotion at all. And again, that's very much a decision based on the individual brands and what they want to do and what kind of proposition they're going for, but also what they feel is right for their brand, essentially. So yeah, it's very much not about kind of like, oh, we're seeing what they're doing, let's copy them. It's about understanding what they're doing so you can make an informed decision about what that means for your data, but also what you might want to be doing in the business as well.
And that's really interesting, actually. Do you know, I've had 2 emails this week from brands where they've said, don't wait for Black Friday. We're not participating. Our best deals are already on the website, which I thought was a really interesting, because it's like, oh, okay, because actually you are in that time now where people go, oh, I need to buy something, or I'll wait because there might be a better offer. And actually, I've caught myself saying that on a couple of things. Normally, maybe those bigger ticket items, they're like, oh, no, actually, don't buy that. I'll wait and see if it goes into the sale. So interesting. And I suppose also just a question from me, which I know we've talked about before, this can apply further than paid as well. Like it can apply to SEO strategies.
Absolutely. Yeah. So obviously the content perspective, this is very much looking at kind of what you're going to be putting live from that side of things, because whilst you think, okay, well, we're going to go with this route, if you haven't necessarily hit the nail on the head with what your consumers want to hear about at that time, but your competitor has, then ultimately your content's just not going to have the same uplift that you would have expected at that time, because it's not speaking to the right motivations that it needs to at that time. From the ad copy perspective, whilst we looked at an ad example of those 3 experiential gifting brands, I'd say that, From an SEO perspective, we can use those learnings within the description lines within your SEO listings as well. So obviously from that total search approach of using the data and insights from one and sharing it with the other, that's a super important way to be able to kind of help enhance your listing, because ultimately, again, your customers aren't necessarily caring whether it's a paid listing or an organic listing. They're looking for the best response and answer to the question that they have asked. So by utilizing that information, and obviously you get a quicker response rate through paid because of the way that the data is processed, means you can get those learnings faster and then apply that to your SEO.
Definitely. No, that's really interesting. So then we've got a question from Alexandra from Green People. Thank you so much, Alexandra. So it's easy to get information from our engaged, loyal customers, but how do we draw out information about what's going wrong from our disengaged customers in order to improve?
Yeah, it's a really good question. So some of the processes that we'll go through are to start with sort of things like customer journey mapping. It's a really helpful way to start to try and visualize that whole journey, because then you might be able to sort of start to pick out some of those ideas of like what's working and maybe what's not. The things like using sort of focus groups, I think surveys are a great way to get sort of surface level information. But ultimately, again, if you're not going to get that buy-in from people who may be disengaged, they're not going to answer it. So you could arguably get a slightly skewed data set because you're going to get the people that are preferentially going to answer that, unless they're going to complain, because everyone loves to complain. But from a focus group perspective, if you can get some of those people and actually sort of genuinely say, look, we're really trying to understand exactly where we can improve as a business, you know, with the right incentives and the right sort of description and language around that, you know, you can kind of engage with those people and get them involved. And I think focus groups are a really nice way of doing that, because people do, and sometimes, you know, you're still going to get some of those elements of what people say, what they, you know, they think you want to hear. But if you can sort of pose it in the right way, you can start to unearth some really interesting insights as people converse and discuss things that maybe they just don't even realize that they felt or knew, which they can then share with you as well. So I think by utilizing different sources, but assuming, you know, just assuming you can get all the data from your internal systems is not the right way to go. It's about kind of asking your customers and getting them involved. And like I said, really explaining to them why it is. The whole thing around like data, zero-party data acquisition, etc. Like if you're explaining the reasons why you want this information, how it's going to benefit, then, you know, ultimately that's a much easier buy-in to get them involved.
I think the key then is then using that data, isn't it? Because we see some people collecting data and then they don't personalize with the data, and then people feel even more annoyed that they've handed over data, and then you're like, but why are you sending me, like, I've told you I like this and you've sent me that doesn't make sense.
And also that feeling of like, well, I don't agree with that as a business. That's a really difficult conversation to have as a team, because ultimately, if that's it's that whole bit of feedback. If someone's told you that's how they feel, whether you agree with it or not, there's something in there, and there's a reason why that is the case. So even if you don't agree with the information you're getting, understanding, well, why, where does that come from? What was the source of that information is going to be really important. So I think it's easy, isn't it, to be like, I'm not listening to that, it's not true. Actually sort of taking that step back and going, okay, actually what is this telling me that maybe is under the surface of what they've actually said from, you know, at the front.
Definitely. And I suppose just thinking of you'd need the right team helping you to do this, but you could almost do a bit of a reverse persona exercise of trying to unpick who do we think our competitors are targeting, and is it maybe that our competitors are targeting these audiences and that's part of our disengaged audience? Maybe we no longer are relevant to whatever persona it might be, and when we think of personas, I guess what's important to us is the motivation to buy. It's not necessarily putting them into a demographic group, but maybe there's something around the motivation to engage with your brand that isn't connecting at the moment, that is connecting elsewhere, and that's why they're disengaged. So I don't know, it's there's different angles to come at it, but that's definitely, I suppose, one, Alexandra, if that's something that a challenge that there is at the moment, by all means pick up with us, and we could dig in a little bit deeper to understand kind of what's happening there and whether we've got some more specific ideas on how to help.
Yeah, just sort of keep talking about this topic because I love this topic. But again, what some brands I've seen, like with that persona piece, if it has been something they've done a while ago and potentially personas are just out of date, or they're just not quite as they should be now. So again, like having that process of reviewing those personas, but also not going with those preconceived ideas of, oh, actually, this is who we think our customer is. It's actually really understanding based on the data who your customer is. Because again, there's been retail brands that I've worked with that have been like, oh, this is our customer, and actually it was a completely different customer to the one they thought they were. So well, that's why you've got a challenge here, because who you think you're speaking to is not actually who wants to buy your product. And regardless of whether that's who you want to buy your product, that is who is buying your product. And so you need to then look at how are you going to address your product range to be relevant to that customer audience that you want, or is it actually that you need to adjust your kind of a marketing strategy towards the actual target market or the people that are buying from you?
So interesting, isn't it? So interesting. We've got a question from Gemma at Night Group. So any advice on explaining what metrics actually matter to stakeholders who do not fully understand SEO, PPC and focus on traffic rather than audience reach? I feel like this is a good plug again for the come and join us on the course.
data. I think it's comforting. I think it's quite a common challenge where we'll have, and even they'll be like, oh yeah, we get that, and then it's still traffic is the answer that we want. That's the answer. That's the solution. As long as we see traffic go up, then they're happy with that. I think a lot of the time it's that it's tricky because some people just sort of set in their ways and they're not necessarily going to want to sort of break out of that. I think trying to get them more involved in things like, as I mentioned already, things like customer journey experience. And that's not just on the website itself, but actually for kind of end to end brings more context, I think, then to the touch points. So for some people, like when we talk about SEO PPC, they've not really considered exactly what that is from a customer's perspective. Like what is that engagement point? So by doing some of that journey mapping to sort of explain, like, this is where those appear in that customer journey, this is the thought process they're going through, and the emotions that are bringing into that, can kind of help to start to realign their expectations around, actually, these are the metrics that matter. And these are the ones that we really need to focus on, rather than it being a case of like, let's just drive loads of traffic to the website because it doesn't work. So I think trying to have more of those conversations, rather than it just being a case like going into a board meeting, presenting the deck, and they're like, I don't care about that, I don't know about traffic. So how do you then create some of those sessions that you can have with them on a smaller scale, where you can get more of that buy-in and understanding around what exactly you're trying to achieve with these channels? Because I think that is a constant challenge. Similar thing is like, when you've got conversion, programmatic, for example, the opposite problem of like, actually, that is the purpose, is to kind of drive awareness, traffic, impressions, viewability, attention, not necessarily conversion. But again, it's like, how do you make sure that there's that understanding of this is where it appears in that funnel, that customer journey, and therefore, because of that, if you were in that position, what would you be doing in that situation? How would you interact with that? Which will then help them kind of have a bit more context. I think a lot of it is just about they haven't necessarily fully appreciated where that appears in the customer journey. So understanding what metrics to use is hard.
Yeah, and it's almost trying to get it away from our digital marketing metrics and back to business metrics, isn't it? It's like, how can you speak in the language that the board report and the team on the board are already speaking, so that actually we kind of try and remove some of the digital marketing speak that means a lot to us. I mean, because I've seen it before, where actually we've lowered a client's traffic because we've really understood the audience that we should be targeting, and we've kind of got away from some of the traffic that maybe they were attracting previously that wasn't converting. And then we have seen much better results. Obviously, conversion rates have gone up, but actually revenue's gone up because we found the right audience. So yeah, traffic is a really dangerous metric sometimes. Obviously, depending on what you're trying to do. Actually, if you are trying to get noise out there in a market and whatnot, then actually maybe traffic is important. But it's trying to pull it back to, what's the purpose of what we're trying to do? Why are we doing it? And how can we turn that more into business speak rather than digital marketing speak? But yeah, it's yeah, you're definitely not alone, Gemma. We've got a question from Francesca. So what do you consider first when collaborating on new content strategies? So I guess thinking, do you start with looking at competitors, or where do you start?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think it's about that audience, customer perspective. It's like, what exactly are they interested in? So I'd say that would be my first place to start, because ultimately, if we don't really know what it is they want to know about, then how can you possibly create the best content strategy to answer those questions? Because anyone who's going, and they're looking for an answer to a question or a need. Ultimately, that's what everybody who is ever going to go onto a website is looking for. But if you don't understand what that need specifically is, or you made an assumption based on what you think that they might be wanting to do, then ultimately that's not going to land. So I would say that always has to be your first port of call. It's really understanding at the moment, what do we need to talk about? What's relevant? What's the latest sort of trends or insight that what people care about, and using that as a basis. And then obviously then trying to understand, okay, what from a competitor perspective, what approach they're taking? Because obviously what you don't want to do is end up with the same content as someone else, because you want to actually potentially look at a slightly different angle, which you as a business can bring to that conversation, that isn't necessarily just the same old content that's coming out from all of the different brands. So then you kind of get lost in the noise.
Makes sense. Question from Colleen Wilson from MCM Staffing. So what is the best way to distinguish yourself from the competitors without bashing your competitors? So I feel like, again, there's probably been the underlying tone of that throughout, but to give that a specific answer.
Yeah, definitely. So as I said, like none of the approach of kind of keeping an eye on your competitors isn't to like try and get one up on them, or to sort of be critical of somebody else. It's really purely just trying to understand what else is going on around you. I think so. By having that insight and understanding, it means that you can make a better decision about what you're doing for your strategy. So yeah, so it's not about kind of picking holes necessarily in what someone else is doing, or like they've got the wrong approach. Like potentially you don't know, like you said earlier, we don't actually know what their strategy is. So it could be right for them as a business because we don't exactly know what they're up to. But it's about what impact it has on yourself. So I think always looking at it in that perspective, and rather than seeing it as negative, it's just trying to get that positive information that can then help understand what's happening with your information.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. So we're getting close to wrapping up time, and we've got two really good questions left. But what I'm going to do, I'm going to give you guys a chance to just give us some feedback before we dive into those final questions, and hopefully to make sure you stay with us. So I'll tell you what the questions are so that you know that they are going to be good ones. So we're going to be asking Lottie, what's the biggest challenge with being responsive and agile with planning? And how do you know what to prioritize? So I think they're two really big tips that are going to help us make sure that we get the most out of what we've just talked about. But Erin's going to pop a survey link in now because feedback's really important to us. And we know, because we understand humans, that if you leave today and don't give us feedback, then we won't get your feedback. So we build the time in. So we're going to give you 2 minutes now to fill in the feedback form, and then we'll come back to Lottie for those final two questions. Thank you. Thank you so much for your feedback. As I say, it really is important to us. So we're going to go to those last two questions. So Lottie, they were, to remind you, I'll do them one at a time. So biggest challenge with being responsive and agile with your planning.
Yeah. So I think the biggest challenge there is potentially getting buy-in from the rest of the business. So if you've already put in together your sort of strategy plan, which that's ultimately what we're going to do for your year anyway, how like making sure that you're baking in the expectation that actually this may need to change. So if you then suddenly need to make an adaptation to the approach you're taking or the language you're using or promotion you're going to go with, that needs to be something that you've flagged to the wider business so that there is that ability to make that change if necessary. But also just having that buy-in in relation to the fact that this is the approach that we're taking, and therefore we do need to be a little bit more agile. So obviously the scale of businesses, but also just generally sort of how it's set up, means that is easier for some businesses than others. But I think that's definitely the biggest one, and a lot of businesses will face.
Definitely, that makes sense. Yeah, that kind of pre-planning that we might change this
Yes.
is really
Yeah,
important,
yeah,
isn't it?
yeah,
That's probably a
exactly.
lesson wider than this as well, like manage expectations. And how do you know what to prioritize when reviewing competitors?
Yes. So I'd actually start with what you're focusing on. So what do you think is important to yourself in terms of your objectives and your KPIs, your USPs that you consider. Then they're good places to start. Because then you can compare what you're doing and what your plan is to your competitors and what's going on there. So if it is a case of like this, because there is so much information and data that you could be looking at. It's like actually like this is what we're going to be doing that's maybe different, new, or this is big for us as a business. Then that's obviously like a really good place to start to try and understand a little bit more about what's going on. Then you can kind of build out from there. So that could be, say, one channel. So start off with just looking at, say, search, for example, and then moving on to one of the channels later on. But I think that's definitely a good place to start.
Definitely. No, that's really, really good. Well, thank you so much, Lottie. You've been fantastic and your voice has lasted. So we're going to let you go back to voice rest. So in your brunch boxes, those of you that got them, you will have got some little mini nudge cards that came through. Obviously, Lottie talked to us about nudges earlier and you had some examples on the screen of what our nudge cards look like. We have got full packs of those nudge cards where there's like 30, 35 nudges in there to help you with your marketing. And we've also got a Brunch and Learn coming up in January, which is all about nudges if you want to learn more about it. So watch out for that. But if you want to get a full pack of the nudge cards, all you have to do is book a follow-up with us. And Erin's going to pop the link into the comments now. We'll also pop this on our follow-ups that we send over. But if you'd like to book a meeting with us, we will get a full pack in the post to you. We've also got our Ask the Experts panel coming up on the 4th of December. So Erin's going to put that link in there as well. So that is going to be a panel. So a bit like this last part, but with a few more people on it as well, talking about predictions for next year. What do we think is going to be happening? What do you need to be tuning into and looking at? And then obviously we talked about the performance and tracking program. We'd love to see you on that. That's a really kind of tight group of people. There's literally only 10 spaces on there so that you can network with each other, learn together, really get your questions answered. So a really tailored program. So if you want to know any more or you want to talk to any of the team that are running that, you can definitely do that. So just let us know. But thank you so much for joining us. Enjoy the rest of your Thursday and we hope to see you at our next one in December. Thank you.